The speaker this morning is Arnold Fruchtenbaum. About 1970, when I was pastoring in Minnesota, and Charlie Clough was pastoring in Lubbock, I got a call from Charlie. And Charlie said, "Hey, I just had a guy speak at my church this last weekend who's pretty good." And he said he's a little short Jew. In fact, Charlie told me they had to bring in a box and put on the floor behind the pulpit so Arnold could see who he was speaking to. And sure enough, I got a hold of Arnold, and we had him come up to our church. In fact, we had you there, I think, 3 or 4 times over the years I was there, and each time we got a box out for him, too. I don't see one here. We hope you make it. Yeah. Yeah. Well, Arnold was born in communist Siberia, Russia. And then in 1947, the Israeli underground helped his family to escape into Germany. That was 47. That was after the war. About 1951, they then immigrated to New York, where at the age of 13, he eventually became a Christian. In 1958, he moved out to God's country in Los Angeles area. I'm prejudicial here. But unfortunately, Arnold had become a Christian, was growing in the faith, and his father took great offense at that, and so Arnold was kicked out of the family. And that relationship has pretty much stayed that way. In 1966, he then applied to and was accepted at Cedarville College in Ohio, where he went on to get a degree. Actually, he got his degree in 1966. In 1971, he got a THM from Dallas Seminary. In fact, he overlapped with me and Charlie there by 1 year. Our last year was Arnold's first. And I can remember something. We all majored under Dr. Walke, who at that time was still a dispensationalist. Brilliant grammarian in the Hebrew. And I remember one day walking down the hall hearing a bunch of students talking and kind of buzzing back and forth, and they were saying there was somebody in Dr. Walke's class that was telling Walke how he should pronounce the Hebrew words. Of course, all the rest of us were in awe of Walke, taking classes from him. The thing was, after the first 2 weeks, you were afraid you were going to die taking his classes. After the next 2 weeks, you were afraid you weren't going to die, Well, Arnold is the founder and the president of Ariel Ministries, and they've recently now relocated back to San Antonio. And actually, you haven't even been here 6 months yet, have you? 10 days. Okay. My wife and I probably had our best educational experience in our lives when we went with Arnold on a 5-week educational tour of Israel, which was just a wonderful trip. And if any of you ever get the opportunity, we'd definitely encourage you to do that. But Arnold, before I take any more of your time, I'll turn it over to you. It's all yours.
Carry on. I hope most of you, if not all of you, picked up a copy of the, not the outline, but the manuscript, and I'll be working my way through there, not reading it, but certain parts we'll have to summarize, and certain parts I'll try to be a bit more in detail. I do have not the manuscript, an outline. If you don't have a manuscript, anyone want an outline? Okay, I saw your hand first. Come up and sign the card. Our topic for this hour and a half is called The Remnant of Israel, Past, Present, and Future, and it's part of a study that sort of came out of my preparations for my dissertation on Israelology for NYU. And my purpose with Israelology was to incorporate theologically as a systematic theology all the Bible teaches about Israel theologically, past, present, and future. In the course of that, I also came across that there's a very clear doctrine of the remnant, within both testaments, but which was for some reason missed by most people. And so this is just a small subdivision of the larger work on Israelology. Now, we begin with the basic meaning. How do we define the remnant? And the basic meaning is that there are, in the Bible, two Israels. Israel the whole, meaning all Jews, all who are descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And within this larger Israel, there's a smaller Israel, which is that part of Israel that believed what God had revealed through Moses and the prophets, and ultimately came to believe that Jesus is the Messiah. And so within the Jewish nation as a whole, there are always some who believe. Sometimes the numbers are quite small, and sometimes they're much bigger, but they're always a minority within the nation. So all who believe among the Jewish people, all who believe among the people of Israel, make up the remnant of Israel. Now from that definition, let me make four specific ramifications. Number one, only believers make up the remnant. It's not comprised of non-believers. Secondly, not all believers are part of the remnant because the remnant is a Jewish remnant. And therefore, only Jewish believers make up the remnant of Israel. Thirdly, the remnant is always part of the nation as a whole, never detached from the nation. The remnant is distinct, but distinct within the nation of Israel. So the remnant is within Israel, not outside of Israel. And fourthly, at any point of history, the remnant could be large or small. In about 2 million people living in the northern kingdom in the days of Elijah, only 7,000, and counting Elijah, 7,001, made up the remnant of Israel of that day. But it's always there. There's always a number of Jews who do believe what God had revealed up to that point. The only time there'll be the exception of rule is at the point of the rapture. All the remnant of Israel is gone, and for a period of time there'll be no members of the remnant until the first Jew comes to believe. Now, as far as the concept of the remnant, basically this was always true. For as long as when the Jews began to multiply from Abraham through Isaac and Jacob, there were some Jews who believed, but as a doctrine, it begins with the account of Elijah the prophet. On page 5 of your outlines, you continue Bibles now to 1 Kings chapter 16. 1 Kings chapter 16. As a doctrine, as I mentioned, the remnant concept begins as a clear teaching. It is to be picked up by the prophets. Now, 1 Kings chapter 16, verses 29 through 34, you have the rise of a new dynasty over the northern kingdom, the dynasty of Omri. Omri's son is Ahab, and Ahab chooses to marry a Phoenician princess named Jezebel that comes from the land of Sidon, in back then known as Phoenicia. And Phoenicia was divided into two main substates, Tyre and Sidon, and she was a princess of the area of Sidon. But with her also comes a new element as far as religious practice is concerned, because up until this point, the worship of the northern kingdom was the worship of the golden calf, and the golden calf was not the introduction of a new religion, it was the corruption of the old religion. Basically, when Jeroboam I made the golden calf, he identified it as the same God who brought Israel out of Egypt. When he dedicated the golden calf, he used the same words that were used by Aaron when he made the golden calf. This is the God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. Again, the worship of the golden calf was the corruption of the true religion, the true faith. But with Jezebel, you have the introduction of a brand new religion, and that is the religion of the worship of Baal, which is a key god of the Canaanites and Phoenicians and so on. And so you have the introduction of a brand new religious system, and now God must deal with Israel in a slightly different way than he has up until now. Now, as we begin to move into chapter 17, we are introduced to Elijah in verse 1. Elijah the Tishbite was of the sojourners of Gilead, sent to Ahab, "As Jehovah the God of Israel lives, before whom I stand, there shall not be dew nor rain these years, but according to my word. And having made his declaration that Israel will suffer a period of total reduction, a total elimination of their water sources, there'll be no rain in the winter months, there'll be no dew in the summer months. That's a total year cutoff of their water supply until God himself intervenes. Now, there are two contrasts in the remnant account we should keep in mind. I won't develop this too thoroughly because of time, but let me mention these and I'll bring out some examples. There are two contrasts. The first contrast is the contrast between the miraculous and the non-miraculous. The second contrast is the contrast between the noise and the quiet. Here we begin to see the first contrast, the contrast between the miraculous and non-miraculous. Because Elijah escapes and he goes by the brook Kerit, and while the water is flowing to the brook of Kerit, the water is supplied non-miraculously. But Elijah's food is provided miraculously by means of these ravens who come feeding him on a daily basis. Eventually, the drought also affects the water that Elijah is drinking from. Now, God could easily use a miracle to provide water for Elijah. He did so for 40 years for 2 million people in the deserts of the Sinai. How much easier it would be just to provide miraculously water for one man. But here again, God will not always work with the miraculous. When the water dries up, God does not choose to work with the miraculous, but sends him outside the country. He sends him to the city of Zarephath, which, by the way, belongs to Sidon. If you look at chapter 17, verse 8. And the word Jehovah came unto him, saying, Arise, go to Zarephath, which belongs to Sidon. Now here you have also another paradox within the life of Elijah, more than one paradox as we'll see, because where did the Jezebel come from? Jezebel came from Sidon. Where's Elijah going to? He goes to Sidon, right to Jezebel's territory. And what happens by the end of chapter 17 is that the Jewish people are worshipping Baal, and Canaanites, Phoenicians, are worshipping the true God. And what Israel should have done is now being done by Gentiles up in the territory where Jezebel came from. Now, when it's time to bring the drought to end, we come to chapter 18, and there's a major contest between the prophets of Baal and the one prophet of God. It's a divine duel, because Elijah calls upon Israel to make a choice once and for all, either choose to worship Baal or choose to worship the true God. If Baal proves to be God, by all means worship him, but if Baal proves not to be God, and Jehovah does, then by all means worship him. Here you have the second contrast, the contrast between the noise and the quiet. Because what the prophets of Baal do is quite noisy. They yell, they scream, they cut themselves, and Elijah's on the sidelines mocking them, and they don't seem to know they're being mocked, and he tells them, maybe Baal is sitting in the toilet and cannot hear you, yell louder. And guess what they do? They yell louder, as if they took Elijah quite seriously. But in the end, we read in chapter 18, verse 29, And it was so when midday was past that they prophesied until the time of the offering of the evening oblation, but there was neither voice, nor any that answered, nor any that regarded. While the prophets of Baal are rather noisy, heaven is very quiet, no response whatsoever. When it's Elijah's turn, he does everything rather quietly, rebuilding the altar had been torn down, praying a quiet prayer. And while Elijah does things rather quietly, the heavens get quite noisy. We see in verse 38, Then the fire of Jehovah fell and consumed the burnt offering and the wood and the stones and the dust, lifting up the water that was in the trench. And the heavens is rather noisy, and it is Jehovah God of Israel, that responds correctly, proving himself to be the only God up in the heavens. Now, based upon the agreement of this contest, Elijah has every expectation to see a mass turning of the Jewish people to worship of the true God. That is his expectation. As we come to chapter 19, that's not what occurs. I believe it should be on page 6 at the moment. Now, what happens when it gets back to the city of Jezreel and the valley of Jezreel is that Jezebel sends a message to Elijah threatening his life. Obviously, she probably knew she could not take his life at this stage of what happened. And if she could, why would she bother giving him a message and warn him in advance? But this event caused Elijah to realize something, that there will not be any mass turning of Israel back to the Lord. And this so discourages him that he flees from the land of Israel down to the land of Judah. He then leaves his servant in Judah and goes further south beyond Beersheba, the southern end of Judah, into the Negev desert. He's not afraid to die. In fact, he requests in verse 4 of chapter 19, he asks God to put him to death. He has no intention of dying at Jezebel's hand, but he wants very much to die. He's that depressed. Another irony of Elijah's life is he's the only prophet I know that asked God to put him to death, and he never died to this day. He said, Lord, put me to death, and God said, never. And so it has been to this day. But in place of putting him to death, God wakes him up by means of the angel. He feeds him some cake. He has a second nap, and then the angel wakes him up again and gives him some more cake, and here's your biblical basis for angel food cake. I'm still looking for devil's food cake in the word, but so far I've not come across it. But it was some piece of cake, no sugar, no salt, no cholesterol, because it says in verse 8, he rose and did eat and drink and went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights unto Horeb, the mountain of God. And this is dry desert territory traveling. And the two pieces of cake lasted him for 40 days and 40 nights. Where he comes to is the mountain range of Horeb. And among the mounts of the range of Horeb is Mount Sinai. And that's where God made his covenant with Israel. That's where Israel said, we will worship only Jehovah. And that's where God said, you will have no other gods before me, neither will you worship any images. And right to a place where God made his covenant with the people of Israel is where Elijah now arrives at. In the verse 9, God asks him a simple question. What are you doing here, Elijah? Hebrew's a bit more terse. What's with you here, Elijah? What's with you here, Elijah? Elijah issues a rather heavy indictment upon Israel in verse 10. I've been very jealous for Jehovah, the God of hosts, for the children of Israel have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altar, slain your prophets with the sword. Even I only am left, and they seek my life to take it away. That's his indictment against the people of Israel for their failure to keep the agreement of turning away from Baal and worshiping the God of Israel. At this point, he has a unique experience where God sends three noisy things. And when God sends those three noisy things, God's presence is not in any of those three noisy things, but in the fourth element, he recognizes the presence of God. God, first of all, sends a wind that beats against the mountain, but God was not within the wind. God sent the earthquake that split the mountain, but God's presence was not in the mountain. God then sends a fire that burns against the mountain, but that was not the presence of God. Then came a still small voice, and in that still small voice, Elijah recognizes the presence of God. And verse 13 tells us it was so Elijah heard it, they wrapped his face in the mantle, a common Jewish response when they're considering the possibility of being present in the presence of God. And once again, God asked him the same question at the end of verse 13, what's with you here, Elijah? In verse 14, word for word the same, he issues the same indictment against the people of Israel. Now, what happens in verses 15 through 18 is that some interpreters have missed the situation, and in some commentaries they say that because Elijah was not more sympathetic, not more loving for Israel, God basically fires Elijah from being the prophet. But that's not really what's happening here, because Elijah is rather heavily used by God even after these events. Rather, verses 15 through 18 is God's response to Elijah's indictment, a response that will take 2 generations to complete. Here again you see 3 things being sent which are noisy, a fourth element that contains the presence of God. Now, in what Elijah's told us to do, three things. First of all, he is to anoint Hazael to be the new king over Syria. And Hazael corresponds to the wind. As the wind beat against the mountain, Hazael will beat against Israel until he reduces Israel to the small city-state of Samaria. Secondly, he's to anoint Jehu to be the new king and new dynasty of Israel. Jehu corresponds to earthquake. As the earthquake split the mountain, Jehu will split the nation. And by the time Jehu is finished, every member of the house of Ahab has been killed. Elisha is to be the one anointed to be the prophet following Elijah. And Elisha corresponds to the fire. As the fire burnt against the mountain, Elisha burns against Israel. If you want to see the difference between the prophetic ministry of Elijah against Elisha, Elijah was the prophet to the nation as a whole, calling the whole nation to repentance. But Elisha was a prophet to the remnant. As for the nation, he's a fire, and where Elisha travels, people die. Shortly after he gets the mantle of Elijah, 42 people come out calling him Baldy, Baldy, and 2 she-bears come out and kill those 42 people. Watch out who you call Baldy. And so these three things God indeed sent, but God's presence was not within these three things. But then came the fourth thing, which is the quiet thing. God tells Elijah there are 7,000 others in Israel. There are probably more in the land of Judah, but as far as Israel, there were 7,000 others who did not worship Baal. And they were so quiet, Elijah didn't even know they existed because he said earlier, even I am left alone, and there's no one else coming with me. And within the 7,000 is the presence of God. That's the quiet. That's what God's presence was, and 7,000 still stood strong against worshiping the god Baal. In the mention of 7,000, you have the introduction of the remnant as far as a key doctrinal element that's also picked up by Romans chapter 11. Let's go now to Isaiah chapter 7. If you're following me in the outline, you should be at the bottom of page 8, moving middle of page 8. Isaiah chapter 7. Now the 6 chapters of Isaiah chapter 7 through 12 is often called the book of Emmanuel. In the Hebrew text, the Emmanuel appears 3 times. There's only twice in English. The Hebrew text appears 3 times. Here again you see one of these 2 contrasts concerning the remnant, the contrast between the noise and the quiet. The basic background is that now Ahaz is king over Judah. Ahaz among the kings that did that which was evil aside the Lord, he was not a believing king. It's also a time when the Assyrian Empire was rising into more and more strength, threatening the smaller kingdoms of the Middle East. And the 2 kingdoms of Israel and Syria had joined alliance to try to stop the Assyrian threat. They were not strong enough to do so. They asked Judah to join up, and Ahaz chose not to join up. So what Syria did was attack the southern part of Judah and taking away what is now Eilat. And then Israel attacked Judah, but could not conquer Judah. And when this point in chapter 7 opens up, the 2 armies, Syria and Israel, came together. The intent was not to destroy Judah. They needed Judah's army. The intent was to depose Ahaz. If that was all they intended to do, God might have allowed them to do so. But the threat went even further. They wanted to depose the whole house of David and bring in a brand new dynasty called the dynasty of Tabeel, unrelated to David altogether. And that would violate the Davidic covenant, and this is something God could not allow to happen. So God sends Isaiah and Isaiah's son to Ahaz to tell him, give him the message. The message is found in verse 3 and 4, not to fear. Trust in the quiet, trust in the Lord, have a quiet confidence in the Lord, but don't trust in the noise. And what he's referring to in the context of chapter 7, 8 is that he has had his own plan. He would align himself with the Assyrians against Syria and Israel, and that would help him out, and he figures he could maintain his freedom. That would not be the case. And so he challenged Ahaz to put his faith in God, but Ahaz chose to trust the Assyrians instead. And that's what happened. So in chapter 8, verses 5 through 8, he draws a contrast between two water sources, the spring of Shiloah, or Siloam, and the river Euphrates. The river Euphrates is where Syria was. The river Euphrates was noisy. But the spring of Shiloah was a quiet spring, the only source of water for Jerusalem in those days. And it was coming out of a mount. At the bottom of the mount, if you look up to the top of the mount, there stood the temple compound. There stood the Solomonic temple. Within the Solomonic temple was the Shekinah glory, the presence of God. And the point is, they should be trusting the presence of God as symbolized by the waters of Shiloah, and not trust the noisy Assyrians symbolized by the Euphrates River. But they chose to trust the noisy Assyrians and not trust the quietness of God. And so God said, if you want the Assyrians, you'll get the Assyrians. You'll get them more than you want. After Assyria destroyed Israel, it then invaded Judah, and from that point on, Judah was in subjugation to the Assyrians, and the Assyrians were defeated by the Babylonians. And so the noise they will trust are the noise that will end up destroying them. And God will be the one to send the Assyrian army, and the Assyrian army will subjugate Judah as well. In chapter 8, verses 9 and 10, he again makes the contrast between the loud roar and Emmanuel. The noise is self-destruction. The noise will lead to self-destruction. It will destroy the non-remnant, but Emmanuel will save the believing remnant. And in verses 14 and 15, he points out that when Emmanuel finally arrives, when Emmanuel comes, he will prove to be two different things. For the remnant, he'll prove to be a sanctuary. For non-remnant, he'll be the stone of stumbling and the rock of offense. And so here Isaiah prophesies that up until Emmanuel comes, the point of division between the remnant and non-remnant is this. The remnant believed what God had revealed through Moses and the prophets. The remnant did not believe and sought idolatry and sold occult practices. When Emmanuel comes, he will become the new point of division. The remnant now believes in the law and the prophets, but when Emmanuel comes, they'll accept him. The non-remnant will reject him. For non-remnant, he'll become a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense. In verses 16 and 17, the attitude of the remnant is they place their trust in the law and the prophets. And in verse 17, they wait upon the Lord. And then he also points out in verse 18 that the family of Isaiah happens to be signs for Israel, primarily the meanings of the name. In chapter 8, verses 1 through 4, one name of a son is Maher-Shalal-Hash-Baz. If you're looking for biblical names for your children, how about this one? Maher-Shalal-Hash-Baz, the spoil speeds, the prey hastens. The spoil speeds, the prey hastens. That's the noise that destroys. His oldest son in chapter 7, verse 3 was called Shar-Yashuv, which focuses on the remnant. Shar-Yashuv means the remnant shall return, because the remnant places their faith in the quietness of God. And Isaiah's name is Jehovah Saves, and Jehovah is the sender of the quiet, that which saves. Jehovah is the sender of the noise, that which will destroy. And in verse 20 it says, the law and the testimony, they speak not according to this word, there is no morning light in them. The law is the law of Moses. Testimony, the testimony of the prophets. Whoever does not speak by the law and by the prophets, there is no morning light in them. So what happens in the book of Emmanuel is that Isaiah gives a clear prophecy. Someday there'll be a virgin producing a child, and when that child is produced, he'll become the new point of division between the remnant and non-remnant. In chapter 10 of the book of Emmanuel, verses 20 to 23, chapter 10, verses 20 to 23, looks forward to final salvation of Israel, pointing out is the final salvation of the future remnant, the last generation before the Messianic kingdom is established. Later in Isaiah chapter 46, verse 3 and 4, chapter 46, verse 3 and 4, God is the one that protects the remnant and guarantees its survival from birth to old age. So in essence, we can summarize the past aspect this way. There is a remnant of Israel, Jews who believe, and the point of division is response to what God reveals. The remnant believes in the law of the prophets. The remnant does not believe in it and pursues idols and produce occult practices. Let's go on now to the present, the bottom of page 8. Now turn to 1 Peter chapter 1. 1 Peter chapter 1. There's a body of epistles which I call Messianic Jewish epistles written specifically to Jewish believers, and these are Hebrews, James, 1 Peter, 2 Peter, Jude. The commentary we produced to Ariel is given that name, the Messianic Jewish epistles. It's important to note exactly who Peter is writing to in verse 1 of chapter 1. Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ to the elect, who are surgeons of the dispersion. If you have a good translation, the word dispersion should be with a capital D. And that's a technical Jewish term for Jews who live outside the land. It's used twice before. It's used in John chapter 7, verse 35, John 7:35, and James 1:1. James 1:1. What's interesting to read among the commentators is when you look at what they say about these two verses, they do it correctly. It's referring to Jews who live outside the land. When they come to this passage, they somehow want to avoid the meaning of the technical term and claim that it is simply addressing believers in general, scattered around the world. There's no reason to avoid the simple literal meaning here. That also refers specifically to Jews, and these are the elect, these are Jewish believers living outside the land. And keep in mind that while Paul was the apostle to the uncircumcision, Peter was the apostle to the circumcision. And therefore this would be part of his goal to reach Jewish people who were of the circumcision with the gospel. Furthermore, twice within this letter he points out he's writing to people who live among Gentiles in chapter 2, verse 12, chapter 2, verse 12, and chapter 4, verse 3. Chapter 4, verse 3. As some commentators try to claim that when Peter says Gentiles, he simply means unbelievers. That's not the normal meaning for Gentile. It is sometimes used for unbelievers, but it's really used that way only in a context where that's obvious. Otherwise, we must go with the primary meaning that simply means non-Jews. These are Jewish believers outside the land living within a Gentile world, and these Gentiles are comprised primarily of unbelievers. Furthermore, in chapter 1, verse 18, 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 18, he points out he's writing to people that have finally left the vain manner of life handed down by the fathers. The phrase handed down by the fathers simply means following your traditions. Very typical Jewish terminology addressing Jewish people. In fact, Peter does not even use the word church anywhere in this epistle. So Peter's purpose is to write to Jewish believers outside the land, living in a Gentile majority. And the purpose is to draw a contrast between the remnant and non-remnant. To show while the non-remnant has failed to fulfill its calling, the remnant has not failed. And what Peter is pointing out here is not necessarily true for the church as a whole. He does say things which are true for all, but certain things are especially true of the remnant of Israel. And here Peter is simply building upon the Old Testament contrast between the remnant and non-remnant. Now look at chapter 2. What's important about chapter 2, verses 1 through 10 is this. In all forms of replacement theology, like covenantal theology, they say this. What the Old Testament used for Israel, Peter says about the church. What the Old Testament said about Israel, Peter uses the same terms, quotes the same verses about the church, which shows the church has replaced Israel, replacement theology, and the church is the new Israel. That's how they often use this passage, and dispensationalists have sometimes inadvertently fell into the same trap. But we keep in mind from chapter 1, he's writing specifically to Jewish believers, having in mind specifically the remnant concept of the Old Testament. We don't have to sacrifice such an important issue. In chapter 2, verses 1 through 3, he's writing to new believers because they're in need of the milk of the Word of God, and milk is for those who are young believers, not yet ready for the meat. In verse 4, he points out the Messiah is the living stone, rejected by men, but elect and precious by God. But in verse 5, he now focuses on the status of the remnant. And the background to verse 5 is the book of Exodus, chapter 19, verse 5 and 6. Exodus 19, verses 5 and 6, where Moses calls upon Israel to fulfill a specific calling, the calling of Israel the whole. And he says Jewish believers are two things. First of all, they're living stones. And living stones makes them part of a spiritual house. In this case, the house would be the Israel of God of Galatians 6:16. Secondly, they're also a holy priesthood. And the whole nation was called upon to be a nation of priests. And while they had a priestly tribe, Levi, to represent Israel to God, the Israel as a nation was to be a nation of priests, representing the Gentiles to God. And they failed to do so. They called upon to present a message of good news to Gentiles, but failed to do so. Israel the whole has failed, the remnant has not failed. And in fact, the new message about the gospel went out initially by members of the remnant, Jewish believers. In verses 6 to 8, he goes on to make a distinction between the remnant and non-remnant. In verse 6, in the first part of verse 7, we have the state of the remnant. He's quoting Isaiah chapter 28:16. Isaiah 28:16 is in the context of a contrast between the remnant and non-remnant. And he points out the chief cornerstone is the Messiah, who before God the Father is elect and precious, so those who believe on him would not be ashamed. And then he makes the application in verse 7. The messianic stone is indeed precious, but it's precious only for the remnant. Isaiah predicted Emmanuel would be a sanctuary, but a sanctuary only for the remnant. The second part of verse 7 and verse 8, we have the state of the non-remnant. He quotes Psalm 118, verse 22, Psalm 118, verse 22, to show us already prophesied that the messianic stone would be rejected by Israel's leaders. In verse 8, he quotes Isaiah chapter 8, verse 14, Isaiah 8:14, to show that for the non-remnant, the messianic stone was to be a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense. And the context of this passage, Isaiah was concerned with the contrast between the remnant and the non-remnant. And again, the whole background to what Peter is writing here is based upon passages in the Old Testament where the contrast is made between the Jews who believe and those who do not believe. And the verse 8, it makes his application. The non-remnant indeed stumbled. For those who rejected the word were destined to stumble. Isaiah predicted that Emmanuel will be the point of division between remnant and non-remnant, and now Peter says that day has come. Jesus, that Messiah, he's now the new point of division between remnant and non-remnant. In verse 9 and 10, it should be on page 10, very bottom, page 11. In verses 9 and 10, again, the background is Exodus chapter 19, verse 5 and 6 of the calling of Israel as a whole. He points out in verse 9, Jewish believers are four things. First of all, they are an elect race, based upon Isaiah chapter 43, verse 20. Elect because they're chosen by God. They are a race, and Peter is dealing with national Israel. The church is not a race, remember. The church is comprised of all believers of all races, but the remnant of Israel is a race. Secondly, they are a royal priesthood. In verse 5, they were called a holy priesthood, which gave them the right to approach the heavenly sanctuary, but now they are a royal priesthood because in Hebrews chapter 7, Melchizedek is priest and king. Messiah is a priest after the order of Melchizedek. We are members of the priesthood. And in this present age, we function as priests. In the future age, we shall function as kings. The church It is true the church is also a kingdom of priests, but you cannot prove it on this passage, which focuses on the remnant, but it's taught 3 times in the book of Revelation. Revelation chapter 1, verse 6, 1:6, chapter 5, verse 10, 5:10, and chapter 20, verse 6, chapter 20, verse 6. So it's true the whole church is a kingdom of priests, but the focus here is specifically on the remnant fulfilling Israel's calling as a whole. Thirdly, they are a holy nation. Israel is called to be a nation holy, separated from sin and from all the nations. Israel the whole has failed, but the remnant has not failed. They're holy because these are the ones of the Jews who do believe. And the church is not a nation. The church is comprised of all believers of all nations. But the remnant of Israel is a member of a nation, the Israel of God. And for they are a people for God's own possession. Israel became a people with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They became a nation under Moses. But they are a special people called for God's purpose. And the background to Israel's calling is Isaiah chapter 43, verses 20 and 21. Isaiah 43, 20 and 21, where God says was called to do a message to Gentiles. The message was 2 points. If Gentiles believe these 2 points, they shall be saved. Number 1, Jehovah is the only God. If this they believe, then they will repudiate idolatry and polytheism. But secondly, he is the only Savior. If they believe him to be the only Savior, they will remove their own works as a means of salvation. That was the message Israel was supposed to present to Gentiles and failed to do so. But now the remnant of Israel has fulfilled that message and therefore has fulfilled that calling. And he concludes with quoting Hosea chapter 1, verse 10 through chapter 2, verse 1, Hosea 1, 10 through chapter 2, verse 1, and then chapter 2, verse 23. In the past, there were members of the non-remnant, not being believers, not being his people spiritually, and without mercy. But now the members of the remnant, therefore they are his people, and therefore they have obtained mercy. And these 10 verses is what Peter is not doing. He is not making a distinction between Israel and the church. He is not making a distinction between unbelieving Jews and believing Gentiles. He is not making the church the new Israel. What he is doing is making a distinction between the Jews who believe and Jews who do not believe. And again, Israel as a whole has failed. The remnant has not failed. And the remnant is fulfilling the calling of the nation as a whole. And now look at Romans 9. It should be on page 12. Sometimes I start talking too fast. If I do that, just say something and I'll slow up. I learned English in Brooklyn, New York, and in Brooklyn you have to say your thing and make a run for it. So I sometimes forget that in the Midwest people tend to not think slower but speak slower. And I need to remember that now and then. Now Romans chapter 9, chapters 9 through 11, we have Paul's own Israelology. I obviously don't have time to do an exposition of all 3 of these chapters, but we'll do certain summaries and focus more on the issue of the remnant. But in chapter 9, verses 1 through 5, he spells out Israel's covenantal privileges. And he points out that Israel has 8 specific things. Notice in verse 4 he says, who are Israelites? Whose is, present tense, not whose was, that these used to be Israel, now belong to the church. They still belong to Israel, even after the cross. But having all these privileges does not necessarily save them. Salvation comes if they put individual faith in what God has revealed. So having these privileges actually holds them to more accountability if they fail to respond correctly. Too much is given, much is required. In order to have these special privileges, not only shows they are without excuse for failing to recognize the Messiah, but in spite of these privileges, they did fail to recognize the Messiah and therefore lost. Having said this, in verse 6, he then explains why. And here again, you have the concept of 2 Israels. Now, they are not all Israel, which are of Israel. Here again, there is Israel, the whole, all Jews that make up the descendancy of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But not all Israel was ever believing. With large Israel, there was the smaller Israel, the true Israel, the spiritual Israel, the Jews who did believe what God had revealed. So we can paraphrase verse 6 as saying, not everyone who is part of Israel really is true Israel. Like Peter, Paul here is not making a distinction between Jews and Gentiles, not between Israel and the church. What he's doing is making a distinction between Jews who do believe and Jews who do not believe, a distinction between the remnant and the non-remnant. And so we must keep in mind there are indeed two Israels, but it's not Israel, little Israel, especially Israel, the church, but Jews who believe and Jews who do not believe. So in Israel the whole, there is the true believing Israel, which is spiritual Israel, but spiritual Israel is made up of Jews who believe. Here elaborates on what he said back in chapter 2, verse 28 and 29, not all Jews are true Jews. Now chapter 9, got in your outline a bit more than I have time to speak up, but go over to page 17. Now, chapter 9, verses 7 through 13, he makes two illustrations. The first one is Ishmael and Isaac, the story of two half-brothers, to show it is the physical descendants who believe are the true children of Abraham. The second illustration is not of two half-brothers, but two full brothers, not just full brothers, but twin brothers, Esau and Jacob. But here again, the blessing went out to Jacob who believed, not to Esau who did not believe. The point is that God's physical promises sometimes go out to the nation as a whole, but the spiritual promises of the covenants go out only to those Jews who believe. Not all Jews participate in the spiritual blessings. Only those Jews who believe participate in the spiritual blessings. In the verses 14 to 29, it goes on to point out that this was a nation who rejected the Messiah. As a result, the gospel went out to the Gentiles. Up until verse 23, it's been dealing with two kinds of Jews, Jews who believe and Jews who don't believe. Those who do not believe have become vessels of wrath. Those who do believe have become vessels of mercy. But as of verse 24, he points out that also among the Gentiles, the same thing's now taken place. Some Gentiles are vessels of wrath, some Gentiles are vessels of mercy. And he points out what the Old Testament had predicted had now finally come to pass. Now, chapter 9, verse 30, it should be on bottom of page 21. From chapter 9, verse 30 to the end of chapter 10, verse 21, he points out that the present status of Israel is that of being sidelined. And now God is dealing primarily with Jews as individuals, not with Jews as a nation. But he begins with the stumbling of the people in chapter 9, verses 30 through 33, beginning with a paradox in verse 30 and 31. The Gentiles did not, like the Jews, have the law, and were not like the Jews seeking after righteousness. Yet the Gentiles did attain the righteousness by faith. Israel did not. And the reason is, Israel tried to attain the righteousness of the law by means of their own works. As a result, they stumbled over the stone of stumbling. Exactly what Isaiah predicted would happen now has taken place. And again, in the context when Isaiah speaks these things, it's in a contrast context between the remnant and non-remnant. This is what happened. Here the Jewish people were struggling very hard to keep the details of the Mosaic law, because they came to believe wrongly the Mosaic law was a means of attaining salvation. If the law was a means of attaining salvation, they had to try to keep the law as perfectly as they could to earn that salvation. Here comes Jesus the Messiah saying all of these efforts to earn salvation is null and void. To earn salvation is simply have to believe upon him to be the Messianic King. If they believe on him as the Messiah, they will receive the righteousness of God upon themselves. Now, for a Jew to agree to that, he would also have to admit all these years of struggling to earn salvation was null and void. And most Jews could not bring themselves to do that. A minority did. The majority did not. they could not come and agree that all their efforts were null and void. And so they stumbled over the messianic stone of stumbling, and as a result they rejected him. And here he quotes Isaiah chapter 8, verse 14, Isaiah 8:14, also Isaiah chapter 28, verse 16, Isaiah 28:16, both passages in the context of the remnant and non-remnant. Non-remnant did stumble, as was prophesied. Remnant did not stumble. Now the question is, why did Israel stumble over the messianic stone of stumbling? He provides three reasons in chapter 10. All three reasons are based upon lines of ignorance. The first line, this is bottom of page 22, the first reason is ignorance of the true channel of salvation. Salvation was always by grace through faith, and not by means of works. And because they assumed the law was given for the purpose of earning salvation, they missed that the means of salvation was always by grace through faith, apart from works. The law was given to one that was already a believer, a rule of life, but not a means of earning salvation. The second line of ignorance in chapter 10, verses should be 12 and 13 on page 25. They're ignorant of the universal character of salvation, because this is what happened. First of all, they were ignorant of the true channel of salvation. It was grace through faith and not the law. But secondly, they made the assumption the law was given only to Jews, and therefore they didn't, the message that only God intended to save Jews. The second line of ignorance came from the first one. The law was given a means of salvation. Secondly, the law was given only for Jews, therefore God only intended to save Jews. Ignoring that the salvation was both to Jews and Gentiles who believe. And now let the third line of ignorance in verses 14 through 21. On page 27, they failed to present the good news to the Gentiles. And that's the third line of ignorance. The law was given as a means of salvation, given to Jews only, therefore God only intended to save Jews, therefore there's no need for us to give a message to Gentiles. And these three lines of ignorance is what was behind Israel stumbling over the messianic stone of stumbling. So in chapter 9, basically, Israel's rejection of Messiah did not catch God by surprise. It was part of God's divine plan. And now, second, in chapter 10, God now works individually and not nationally. Now we come to chapter 11, where the remnant doctrine comes in again. In chapter 11, verses 1 through 10, on page 27, Israel's rejection of Messiah is not total. There are Jews who believe. And in verse 1 he says, I say then, did God cast off his people? God forbid. The people of chapter 11, verse 1, the same people as chapter 10, verse 21. The same people that rejected him are still his people. God's people are called his people even when they are in unbelief, as you see here. And the question now is, a lot of Israel's failure to recognize the Messiah, did God cast off his people? Is he through with the Jews? Earliest time of replacement theology coming in. And the answer is, God forbid. More literally from the Greek, may it never be. It's the strongest Greek negation. Literally, may it never be, or perish the thought. If I was to give you a literal Greek rendering, it would be something like this. Are you out of your Vulcan minds? From God's perspectives and God's faithfulness, this is inconceivable. And the proof is Paul's own salvation. If God was true with the Jews, then no Jew could be saved. But the fact that Paul is a Jew and is a believer shows God has not cast off his people. And furthermore, you have the foreknowledge of God. God in his foreknowledge chose Israel in spite of his knowledge that they would reject the Messiah. And the fact that God foreknew Israel and chose Israel shows he did not cast off Israel. The foreknowledge of Israel forbids the casting off of Israel. At this point, someone might simply blow a whistle and say, now wait a minute, Paul. We understand there are some Jews who believe. In fact, we have some Jews here in the Church of Rome. But let's be honest. The vast majority of the Jewish people have not believed. Does that not indicate in some way that God has cast off Israel as a nation, though he allows some Jews to be saved? The argument is this. because only a minority believed shows God has cast Israel off. That's the argument. Because only a minority believed, this shows God has cast Israel off. And the answer comes rather quickly from the Old Testament with the Elijah account. It reminds me of the Elijah story, that back in Elijah's day, in the northern kingdom, only 7,000 believed. And yet nobody was saying that then God cast off Israel because only a minority believed. His point is this: the existence of a minority, no matter how small, even only down to one, will always be evidence God has not cast Israel off. A minority of believers does not prove casting off, it proves a not casting off. When there's one Jew who believes, it is evidence that God has not cast off his people. He makes his application in verse 5. Even so, that's the comparison, then the inference, and the point is, what was true then is true now. There's a remnant according to election of grace, and the Jewish believers, the Messiahship of Jesus today, make up the remnant of Israel. And they make up this special calling of the people. And their existence shows God has not cast Israel off. And furthermore, these are the Jewish people recognized as salvation is by grace through faith in verse 6. Insofar as salvation is concerned, grace, faith and works are not compatible. So in verse 7, he draws his conclusion. What Israel sought after, they failed. But the elect remnant did not fail, they attained it, while the rest were hardened. And again, there's a contrast between remnant and the non-remnant. And in verses 8 through 10, he goes on to quote passages from all three divisions of the Hebrew Bible. The law in Deuteronomy chapter 29, verse 4, Deuteronomy 29, verse 4, the prophets, Isaiah 29:10, Isaiah 29:10, the writings, Psalm 69, verse 22-23, Psalm 69, 22-23, to show Israel's rejection was prophesied, Israel's hardening was prophesied, so nothing should catch us by surprise. Now go to page 30. In verse 11 through 15, he spells out the purpose of Israel stumbling. Israel stumbled so that the gospel could go out to Gentiles. Verse 11, again, a question is raised that he intends to refute. I say then, did they stumble? They might fall. And the word for fall means to fall irrevocably, never to rise again. Now, back in chapter 9, he said Israel did stumble, but now the question is, do they stumble to fall, never to rise again? And again, the answer is, God forbid, may it never be. Rather, the purpose of Israel stumbling so salvation could go out to Gentiles. But now he points out a key purpose of Gentile salvation, which is to provoke the Jews to jealousy. Now, the phrase to provoke to jealousy is one Greek word that comprises two Greek words, para, P-A-R-A, to come alongside of, and zelos, Z-I-L-O-S, which means to be zealous or to be envious or to be jealous, envious, or zealous. But the root meaning is to be hot, to be made red hot, to burn, to seethe. And the point is this: a Gentile believer is to come alongside, para, a Jewish unbeliever, and live such a life and be such a consistent testimony that the unbelieving Jew begins to seethe and burn with jealousy. He finally says, what in the world is this goy, this Gentile doing? My Messiah become a believer himself. Sadly, through much of church history, the church has done more to provoke the Jews to anger than to jealousy. While the church has failed to complete this mission, individual Gentiles have not failed. And the vast majority of Jewish believers, even to this day, will came to the Lord through Gentiles to provoke them to jealousy. That's true in my own case. I finally became a believer because I was provoked to jealousy by a Gentile believer. And that is true with the majority of Jewish believers. They came to faith through Gentile believers to this day. In our EL staff, we have both Jewish and Gentile missionaries. The most productive missionaries have been the Gentile members, not the Jewish members. And so he points out that that is the major function of Gentile salvation, for Jews to jealousy. So in verse 13 and 14 he says, but I speak to the Gentiles, Inasmuch as I am an apostle of Gentiles, for my ministry many means to work to jealousy in my flesh, I may save some of them. What he's saying here is, I am delighted that God called me to do Gentile evangelism. I am happy to do Gentile evangelism. Why is he so happy about it? Because it's so much easier? Maybe it's easier. Some of you are a bit slow on that one, but the reason he gives is otherwise. He says, I am delighted that God called me to Gentile evangelism. Here's why. And he was raised as a rabbi. He's using rabbinic logic here. Because the more Gentiles I bring to the Lord, there'll be that many more Gentiles to provoke Jews to jealousy. There'll be that many more Jews also come to faith. And that's his pattern of thinking. The more Gentiles he brings to faith, there'll be that many more Gentiles that provoke Jews to jealousy, and so many more Jews will also come to believe as well. And that's been proven to be true over and over again. And so keep in mind the key mission of why you're here, if you're a Gentile believer, is to provoke Jewish people to jealousy. But the provoking must not be merely by doing nice things for Jewish people. That's to be a presentation of the gospel. It's rather sad nowadays there are several different evangelical groups who say they're called not to evangelize Jewish people, but to do nice things about them. I'm all for doing nice things for the Jewish people, but it cannot be apart from presentation of the gospel, and nobody will be saved by how we live. How we live must conform with what we believe, but not saved by how we live, but there must be a verbal presentation of the gospel, as even said earlier in chapter 10, verses 16 through 19. Faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the word of God. In verses 16 through 24, it should be on page 31 and 32, he now brings in his example of the olive tree. Now, the olive tree does not represent Israel. This was represented by the natural branches, members of the remnant. The tree is not the church or Gentile believers. The Gentiles represented by the wild olive branches. But the tree represents a place of spiritual blessings. What's happening in the Messianic movement, however, is that many Gentiles become part of it. There's a proper way to be part of it by mere identification, but it's quite another to try to become one. Many Gentiles in the Messianic movement are rather angry at God for making them Gentiles. They try to find ancestors centuries before them that might have been Jewish. Some even convert to Judaism. Some even end up renouncing the faith in the Messiah as well. I want to make it quite clear that's perfectly all right to be a wild olive branch. I married a wild olive branch. I like him a bit wild. But the trees have been made up of these two types of branches, natural branches and wild olive branches. The tree represents the place of spiritual blessings of the Jewish covenants, rooted in the Abrahamic covenant specifically. And in verse 17 he says, but some of the branches were broken off, and you being a wild olive was grafted among them, this become partaker with them through the fatness of the olive tree. And the key word that Paul always uses in three key passages is the word partaker. The Gentile believers do not take over the Jewish covenants, as in replacement theology. The Gentile believers become partakers of the Jewish covenants. Now, he uses the word twice before, and twice two other places. One place is Ephesians chapter 3, verses 5 and 6. Ephesians 3, verses 5 and 6. Gentiles become partakers of the promise in Christ Jesus. Turn over for a moment to chapter 15 of Romans. Chapter 15, verse 25 and 26, he points out the Gentile churches of Macedonia and Greece have been collecting funds for the poor saints of Jerusalem. Is this strictly a goodwill gesture, a showing of Christian love? It's more than that. Look at verse 27. Yet it has been their good pleasure, and the debtors they are, for if the Gentiles have become partakers, there's the word again, of their, meaning Jewish spiritual things, they want them to minister them in material things. And the giving for the Church of Jerusalem was not based upon purely Christian love, but a theological issue, because Gentile believers have become partakers of Jewish spiritual blessings. They become in debt. The way they pay off the debt is by sharing with Jewish ministries in a material way. As the given application, if a local church begins to map out the missions given, they should begin with a Jewish ministry to support. Individual Gentiles, when they give out the missions given, they should pick a Jewish ministry to support. If you cannot think of a good Jewish ministry to support, there is one I can highly recommend. And if you can support more than one, that's fine. If you can only support one, then I think God wants you to go in alphabetical order. Back to chapter 11 before I get too self-serving here. In chapter 11, the tree represents the place of the spiritual blessing of Jewish covenants. And Jewish and Gentile believers are partaking of these spiritual blessings, which are Jewish blessings, but the tree still belongs to the Jewish people, specifically the remnant of Israel. Look at verse 24. If you were cut of that which is by nature a wild olive tree, was grafted contrary to nature into the olive tree, how much more shall these which natural branches be grafted into their own olive tree? Notice the possessive pronouns, their own olive tree. The tree belongs to the natural branches. That's why the tree cannot be Israel. Israel is represented by the natural branches. Israel owns the tree and therefore cannot be the tree. Suppose I have a car. It's my car, but me and my car are two different things. If I give you a ride from Houston to San Antonio, you're partaking the benefits of my car, but still my car. That's the point here. The tree is not Israel, but it's owned by Israel, especially the natural branches. And Gentile believers are partaking of the spiritual blessings, but do not become the owners of the tree. The tree belongs still to Israel to the present day. Now, this will not be on your manuscript, but turn now to Galatians 6 for a moment, because there's one other passage we should mention before we do the last segment in the future. Galatians 6. In my research to the dissertation of theology, I came across several covenantal writers who I quote in the book. They simply make graphic statements such as, in the New Testament, Israel and the church are simply used interchangeably, without any evidence to back up that statement. When you get down to nitty-gritty, they do admit, regardless of what they say earlier, only down to one verse. Now, the word Israel is used exactly 73 times in the New Testament. 73 times exactly. Even covenant theologians agree that 72 of those times it's used of ethnic Jews. Either Jews who believe or all Jews, but ethnic Jews. The one exception I always point to is this verse right here. As it reads in my ASV, Galatians 6:16, as many as shall walk by this rule, peace be upon them and mercy, and upon the Israel of God. And this version, as most versions do, the word kai is taken as primary meaning as simply and. What they want to do is resort to a rather rare meaning of the word kai and make the word mean even. Peace be upon them, even upon the Israel of God, therefore only to one group here, not two. If you happen to be using an NIV, NIV is a paraphrase regardless of what they claim, and paraphrases take certain liberties, translations would not. And you'll notice that whoever did Galatians for the NIV translation was a replacement theologian. He translated it as even the Israel of God instead of and the Israel of God. My own preferred translations in preferential order is the ASV, NASB, New King James, Old King James. If you want to just simply get the gist of what a Bible book teaches, it's okay to read NIV, but it's not a good Bible to study from. My observations of believers that have not progressed from milk to meat, not progressed from maturity to maturity, have been tested NIV positive. Now, the background here, this book deals with Gentiles trying to attain salvation through Jewish rituals and Jewish works. They were deceived by Judaizers. Jewish people, at least claimed to be believers, perhaps they were, but they did not understand the full nature of salvation by grace through faith. And so throughout the book, he does draw this contrast between Jews and Gentiles. Look back at chapter 2 for a moment. Chapter 2, verse 7. Chapter 2, verse 7. But contrariwise, when they saw I had been entrusted with the gospel of the uncircumcision, even as Peter was entrusted with the gospel of the circumcision, he that wrought for Peter unto the apostle of the circumcision wrought also for me unto the Gentiles. When they perceived the grace that was given unto me, James and Chafer and John, who were reputed to be pillars, gave to me and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship, which should go unto the Gentiles, and they unto circumcision. And the contrast between the circumcision and uncircumcision has been consistent. Go back to chapter 6, look in our verse 15. Neither is circumcision anything or uncircumcision, but a new creature. And the point of verse 15 is the important thing for salvation is not who is circumcised, who is not circumcised. And he mentions the two groups as he's been doing throughout the epistle. It represents Jews and represents Gentiles. And in verse 16, it simply pronounces God's blessing upon members of both groups who recognize salvation is by grace through faith apart from the works of the law. And so, peace be upon them, the Gentile believers who recognize that salvation is by grace through faith alone, and upon the Israel of God. Israel of God are those Jews who do believe. And that's simply referring to the remnant of Israel, and rather than to Gentile believers. And furthermore, in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 18, 1 Corinthians 10, 18, it's a contrast between Israel after the flesh. Israel after the flesh is the non-remnant. Here the Israel of God is the remnant. Again, simply describing two types of Jews. One more thing about the present. Isaiah chapter 65 verse 8. Isaiah 65 verse 8 says this: the function of the remnant is they keep Israel alive. And the reason God has chosen not to destroy Israel in spite of Israel's many sins is because there is always a believing remnant. Remnant, no matter how small, will always guarantee Israel's existence as a whole. Let's go on now to page 33. And let's go on to the future. He'll simply summarize some things and allow some time for questions. Now, as far as the remnant in the tribulation, on the bottom of page 33, in the tribulation we shall see development of four different groups of Jews. First of all, the 144,000 Jews of Revelation chapter 7, Revelation chapter 14, chapter 7 and 14. These are all single male Jews that God primarily used to evangelize the world. They'll be part of the remnant. A second part of the remnant are individual Jews who become believers throughout the tribulation, but they are not part of the 144,000. In Revelation 11, verse 13, the writer points out that the Jews of Jerusalem are saved at the middle of the tribulation. They'll make up the remnant. It mentions the remnant also in Revelation chapter 12, verse 17. Revelation 12:17 says, Satan will make a war against the woman, the Israel in general, but specifically be targeting the Jews who believe in Jesus. Now, capital B on the page, very bottom page, they treat the favorable remnant. This comprises about one-third of the Jewish population as a whole of tribulation. And most of these will go through a tribulation, unbelievers as far as Jesus is concerned, but some believers as far as the Antichrist is concerned. And these are the non-many of Daniel 9, verse 27, Daniel 9:27, that will not have anything to do with the covenant that began the tribulation. And they will survive the tribulation, they'll escape to the place of refuge, and it is this one-third that become the all Israel that will be saved. Isaiah chapter 10, verse 20-23, Isaiah chapter 10, verse 20-23 spells out the fact of the remnant. The remnant will survive, and while the rest of Israel leans upon the one that smote them, the remnant will not lean upon the smote them, they'll lean upon the God of Israel. And in two passages, there's a divine protection and provision for the remnant. Isaiah chapter 41, verses 8 through 20, Isaiah 41, 8 through 20, Isaiah 65, verses 8 through 16, Isaiah 65, 8 through 16, page 34, that our God will not provide food and water for the non-remnant, he will provide food and water for the remnant. And on page 35, we come to Israel's national salvation. Turn back to Romans 11. In verse 25, he says, "For would not have you, brethren, of this mystery, lest be washed your own conceits, the heart and part before this one, until the fullness of the Gentiles be come in, so all Israel shall be saved." You don't have to be a believer too long to recognize how the church has been fragmented through the centuries, and even within the broad denominations, we have subgroups. The largest Protestant group in the USA is the Baptist Church. We have more than one Baptist group here. We have here the American Baptist, the Conservative Baptist, the Southern Baptist, General Association of Regular Baptists, the General Baptist Conference, the Bible Baptist, the Baptist Bible, the Free Will Baptist, and the Reformed Baptist, the Missionary Baptist, even a group called the Primitive Baptist Church. I speak in many different Baptist churches. I've not yet spoken in the Primitive Baptist Church. I'm afraid to go because without name, they might make me wear only a loincloth and nothing else. Another group is the Brethren Church. In the USA, we have a number of different Brethren groups. We have the Open Brethren, the Closed Brethren, the Mennonite Brethren, the Plymouth Brethren, and some others. It's perfectly right to be a member of these Brethren groups I just mentioned, but there is one Brethren Church the Bible forbids anybody to join. The Brethren group he mentions here in verse 25, where it says, "I would not have you ignorant brethren." Never join any church called the Church of the Ignorant Brethren, because the Bible forbids you to do that right here. We just don't want them to be ignorant about those two things. First of all, they should not be ignorant about the fact that Israel's hardening is partial, because it's partial always become Jews who believe. But then secondly, it's temporary until the fullness of the Gentiles be come in. And the Greek word for fullness means a set number, and God has a set number of Gentiles He intends to bring into the body. He's not told us what the set number is. We must continue to evangelize, witness, missionize until the set number is reached. Once the set number is reached, the rapture will then occur. Then God will again begin to deal with Israel, and eventually He says all Israel will be saved. The verse does not mean all Jews of all time will be saved. It does mean all Jews at a certain point of time will be saved. And unfortunately, some teach that we shouldn't bother doing Jewish evangelism because eventually all Jews will be saved anyway. This does not mean all Jews of all time, only all Jews at a certain point of time. And Jewish people today who die without faith are just as lost as any Gentile who dies without faith. And but the promise is that someday a whole generation of Jewish people will come to faith. Now, this will appear to contradict the passage we saw in Isaiah chapter 10, verse 20 and 23. Chapter 10, verse 20 and 23, that only a remnant will be saved. He says, "Although your people will become as numerous as the sand of the sea, only a remnant of them shall return." So how does Isaiah chapter 10 correspond with Romans 11? Look at Zechariah 13. Zechariah will be the second book from the back of the Old Testament. The last book is the Italian prophet, Malachi. Just go past the Malachi papers. Zechariah 13, verse 8. Zechariah 13, verse 8. "It shall come to pass in all the land, says Jehovah, 2 parts of you shall be cut off and die, but the third shall be left therein. I'll bring the third part into fire. I'll refine them as silver to refine. Will try them as gold is tried. They shall call on my name when I will hear them. I will say, it is my people. They shall say, Jehovah is my God." Notice what he says. The tribulation, as a result of tribulation judgments, 2/3 of Jewish people living in the time the tribulation starts will not survive it. 1/3 will. And as 1/3 that survives, all come to saving faith. And Israel's salvation is the prerequisite to the second coming. And now will lead to the second coming in chapter 14, verses 1 through 15, the kingdom in verses 16 to 21. But the all Israel is all the Jews who survived the tribulation, as Zechariah points out here. All right, the last thing on your, it should be on page 38. There's a summary statement. As far as the Messianic kingdom is concerned, the Bible teaches all Jews who are born in the kingdom will come to believe. So during the kingdom, all Israel and remnant of Israel become one and the same. All Israel and remnant of Israel become one and the same. But certain passages which are listed, which I won't take time to list now, emphasize specifically the remnant motif for the Messianic kingdom. So in past, present, and future, there is a special teaching about the remnant. And if we don't confuse the remnant with the church as a whole, that takes away a major argument replacement theology is used against our position in all these years. All right, let me make a couple of announcements. Still about 10 minutes for questions because I think I'm allowed to go till 10 o'clock. I meant to bring a bunch of our brochures, but we just recently moved from California to Texas. It's like coming out of Egypt to the land of Israel. And so I only had 4 in my case of these REL brochures. And if you get one of these, I'll leave it up here. There's a place in here for your name and address. You want to be on our mailing list. Simply fill out your name and address and turn this in. If you don't have one, just give me any piece of paper, name and address. You fill that out. We'll send you some more information about the ministry as a whole, and we'll send you a copy of our catalog that lists about 199 other manuscripts besides this one you can get and other teaching facilities. We'll send you a copy of my personal testimony. This shows I was saved in 2 separate stages. I was first of all saved in Brooklyn. Secondly, I was then saved out of Brooklyn, in that order. I'll give you the details. Then every 3 months, it's a quarterly newsletter that looks like this. It is 12 pages. At the outer 8 pages will be news of our branches. We're in 7 different countries, news of Jewish people coming to faith, articles on Jewish customs, tradition, and beliefs. But inside 4 pages is written our Bible study. Every issue picks a specific topic. You can separate this from the rest, read, study, use this. God might give you to use it. Free of charge. If you want to receive it, either fill out the slip or give a piece of paper, name and address. Sometime today, because I have to leave after lunch today. But sometime in this morning's hours, let me have it. I'll be happy to send it to you. All right, we have 8 minutes. Any questions?
First of all, Dr. Arnold, I just want to say thank you for an excellent presentation. It's very informative. On page 4, you said that Jewish believers have a dual citizenship. They are part of both Israel and the church, and naturally within the remnant. Mm-hmm. And in Romans 9, Paul says that all Israel is not Israel. So basically, Professor, I have a 3-part question.
You're a Trinitarian?
Pardon?
Are you a Trinitarian?
I like that. That's good. First of all, is there a remnant in the church age? And if there is one, how would it be classified? 2,
let me go one by one, because if you go through all 3 questions, I may forget the first one by the time you ask me the third one.
All right.
And look at Romans 11, verses 1 through 10. It says, even so now, this is the church age, even so now there is a remnant according to election of grace. So even in the present age, there is a remnant, and the Jewish believers in Jesus make up that remnant. And therefore, the Jewish remnant today is part of Israel, the remnant, but also part of the church, the Jewish wing of the church. So in that sense, we're dual citizens or dual nationals.
Okay, now would the remnant in the church age would be the equivalent to the remnant in the Old Testament?
It's the same remnant, but the difference is the content of faith. Because what we have to believe to be honest, the remnant now is that Jesus died for our sins, was buried, rose again, which was that alone for our salvation. That makes up the remnant today. That's not what Moses believed. That's not what Abraham believed. They have to believe whatever God had revealed up to that point of time. So whatever God had revealed at that point of time, that's what they believed. So you remember the remnant based upon believing what God had revealed up to that point of time. But it's all one remnant of Israel. But the content of faith is not always the same.
So maybe you've answered my last question. Is the term remnant only associated with Israel in the Old Testament and the New Testament? Because I know in the church age, we have believers, but yet we have believers following doctrine, then we have believers not following doctrine. But yet in the Old Testament, you had all of Israel, then you had Israel that believed, which was the remnant, and Israel that didn't believe, which wasn't a remnant. So that's what I'm trying to clarify.
Well, the New Testament, the term remnant is the same as the Old Testament. Always refers to Jews who believe. But the issue now, they believe in the Messiahship of Jesus. That's what they believe now. Now, obviously, the Gentiles will believe as well, but the word remnant is not applied to Gentile believers. It's applied to Jewish believers. Yeah.
Arnold, I know you see a distinction between Jewish believers and Gentile believers in this remnant, but do you see the remnant enjoying a place of special privilege or blessing that the Gentile believer in Christ does not?
Now, I don't see any special blessings for Jewish believers. What I see is certain different obligations, but there are no special blessings. Blessings achieved by own obedience. So Jewish believers who obey more than others receive greater blessings, and Gentiles who believe more than others receive greater blessings. The position of blessing is the same. The issue is responsibility, not getting more blessings.
Question on the content of what must be believed by the Jew for salvation, based upon Romans 10, 9, and 10. I accepted Christ when I was 10 years old. 4 years later, I discovered that the Jesus in whom I had believed was also the Lord God Jehovah of Israel. Romans 10, 9, and 10 appears to require that a Jewish person must believe that the Jesus of the Incarnation, who was raised from the dead, is also the Lord God Jehovah of Israel, and he must believe that in order to be saved.
Well, as we're this way, he cannot deny it and be saved. How much he understands the point of salvation may not always be clear. But in Jewish evangelism, you have to touch on that subject, because we deal with certain messianic prophecies, like Isaiah chapter 9, verse 6 and 7, his name shall be called Mighty God, and so on. You cannot avoid it. So, to my knowledge, in Jewish evangelism, the deity of the Messiah is always emphasized, always brought up in some part of the discussion. Sadly, in the Messianic movement, some who came to faith that way are now denying it or playing it down. And some leaders of the Messianic movement said the Trinity is not an important doctrine, and so on. But if you deny his deity, that questions your salvation. Question? Okay, 1, 2, 3.
Those who seek to say that Peter included Gentiles in his directed message use 2, 9, and 10, that they were in time past not a people, but now are the people of God, which had not obtained mercy, but now have obtained mercy. So I understand that you're saying that in the sense that it was applied to Hosea's two sons, Malani and Ami. Is that, am I understanding?
Yeah, Hosea was referring it specifically to northern kingdom of Israel. That was Hosea's target. And both Peter and Paul used this message. Now, Peter applies it specifically to a remnant of Israel, regardless of what tribe they're from. Paul applies it to Gentile believers because they're must not by people. So Paul is an application of what Hosea said. But Hosea spoke about Jewish people. I think Peter follows that format, but Paul does apply to Gentiles in Romans 9, correct. Who was the second one here? Okay.
Just looking around at Jewish ministries and non-Jewish ministries and so forth, it looks as if there's not a great deal of interaction between them, which is unfortunate, of true believing Jews and true Gentiles in a dispensational area. Unfortunately, there's not enough connection, as I see it anyway, between those groups. And how would you address that, Arnold?
I missed the first part of the question. Try again.
To me, there's not a practical connection between Jewish ministries out there, Messianic ministries, Hebrew ministries, and so forth, and we as ministries in the Gentile area. How do we bridge that gap?
The best way to bridge that gap is to be involved frontline Jewish evangelism in the area, if your church happens to be nearby a Jewish area. Sometimes you're not, so that limits what you can do. But if your church in a city like Houston or elsewhere where there is a Jewish community, I would join up with a Jewish ministry, whether it's a Messianic congregation, whether it's Jewish mission, like Ariel or Chosenville Ministries or something like that, and go actively out to reach the Jewish community. That's the way I would do it. Okay, one more somewhere. Somebody had a hand here. All right, let me then close you with about 2 or 3 rabbi stories, and then... By the way, as far as my trips to Israel, the next trip I'm doing, which is a long trip, will be a 4-week study tour from mid-August to mid-September. I limited my group to 25 people, and it's about half full at the moment. We'll take less. We just won't take more than 25. So if you're interested in going, see me afterwards, and I'll give you the address to contact. The background to the first story I'll tell you is that in Judaism we're not taught to pray extemporaneously. All our prayer books, all our prayers were through prayer books. So we had a daily prayer book, there's a Sabbath prayer book, a prayer book for every occasion. All our prayers were prescribed prayers. Stories of a rabbi who was now elderly, retired from the rabbinate, and he came to us in his old age that he did not know that God was any better now than he did when he was a child. He made a very unusual decision for an Orthodox rabbi who closed his Bible, prayer book rather, and pray for the first time with his own words. Then maybe God will hear, and if so, maybe God will answer. And if so, he's got a few questions to ask God to get to know God better. He closed his book and prayed on his own words. He stumbled a lot in the beginning. He wasn't used to praying that way, but afterward got smoother, more eloquent. After a while, praying this way for a long time, he heard a voice from heaven saying, "Yes, Rabbi, what do you want?" Rabbi says, "I want to ask you just a few questions to get to know you better." And God says, "So ask." Well, my first question is, what does time mean to you? God says, time to me is something like this. To me, a second's like a million years. A million years is like 1 second. A rabbi says, Well, my second question is, what does money mean to you? And God says about the same. 1 penny to me is like $1 million. $1 million is like 1 penny. The rabbi says, in that case, O Lord, I have a third question. Can I please have one of your pennies? And God said, of course. Just wait 1 second. What's common with rabbi stories is the logic. The logic doesn't quite work right. That's the example. The second story is of a rabbi who had a synagogue, Orthodox synagogue in New York City, a small one. And so he got paid, but only enough to make his expenses, never got any money left over. And he knew his Old Testament well, but never anything about the New Testament. He also had this great desire to visit Israel, but never had the money to go. But after the course of a number of years, a donation came in with that designation, which allowed him to go to Israel for 1 month. There was also enough money there to take his wife with him, so he has to come with him. And she said, well, if I go, I'll have to take my mother with me. Rabbi says, this is not a good idea. Let's be honest. Your mother and I just don't get along. Every time she comes over, there's always one argument, sometimes two. We'll be in Israel for 30 days. That's 30 arguments, up to 60 arguments. Not a good idea. His wife said, listen, if I go to Israel, I don't bring my mother, I'll never hear the end of it. She will kvetch, she will complain, she will drive me to an early grave. To maintain peace in the family, either go by yourself, that's fine with me, but if you want me to go, I have to bring my mother with me. Rabbi said, well, I really don't want to go without you, I don't want to go alone, so bring your mother, I'll find a way to live with it. After they go, and just like he feared, every day there was one argument, sometimes two. But halfway in the trip, they're in Jerusalem, and suddenly his mother-in-law has a heart attack and passes away. They've got to figure out how to bring the body back to birth at the New York Jewish Cemetery, where the family is. And so he went to the New York consulate and asked them about this, and they said, because there's so much red tape in this country, if you want to bring your mother to New York, it'll be very expensive. It'll cost you about $30,000. But listen, she's a Jewish woman. She's qualified to be buried right here in Jerusalem. It'll only cost you about $3,000 and save you a lot of money. Rabbi thought for a moment or two and said, no. No matter what the cost, I want that body sent back to New York. I'll find a way to pay for it later. And the consulate worker said, you must really love your mother-in-law to go through all this expense. Rabbi says, well, to be honest, it's not quite where I'm coming from. You should remember a story. I don't remember how I got the story. Maybe I read it somewhere. Maybe somebody told me the story. I just don't know. But years ago, I heard of a story of a man who was buried here in Jerusalem. Then 3 days later, he came back to life. Can't take that chance. The third one comes from England. The European restaurants, by the way, outside the restaurant door, there's always a menu which tells you what they're going to be serving, so you know what's available to you before you go in. was an Orthodox rabbi who was kosher all of his life, but he developed this deep curiosity, what in the world does pork taste like? He couldn't just go out and buy some and bring it home, ruin his dishes, and throw those dishes away. He went to a nearby restaurant, he might be recognized and then lose his job. So what he did was decided he would go for a very long drive out in the country, and he found a restaurant far enough away from anybody would know him that served suckling pigs. So he took his skull cap off, went inside, ordered the suckling pig. As they serve it to him, he gets knocked on the shoulder, looks up, and there's one of his parishioners happened to be working there. The rabbi didn't realize that. The man says to Rabbi, what in the world are you doing? Rabbi said, can you believe this place? I came in here and ordered just a baked apple. Look how they serve it here. It's my last one. It's a short one. Comes from Germany, actually. A town, there was one village, was one Catholic church and one synagogue, one priest and one rabbi. And one day the priest decided he'd like to do a very nice thing for the rabbi without telling him, a goodwill gesture for the rabbi. Notice the rabbi's car was rather dirty. He decided to wash the rabbi's car for him, and that's what he's doing. Rabbi looked out of his second-story flat and saw a black-robed priest splashing this water all over his car. A day passes, and the priest looked out his window. He saw Rabbi approaching the car the priest would drive, and the rabbi's hand was a saw, and he sawed several inches off the tailpipe of the priest's car. The priest came out running. Rabbi, what in the world are you doing to my car? Rabbi said, yesterday I saw you baptizing my car. Now I'm circumcising your car. I'm done.